While millions of eyes stay fixed on Yellowstone, watching and waiting for America's famous supervolcano to show the slightest hint of danger, something extraordinary is happening on the other side of the Atlantic, something most people have never even heard about. There's another supervolcano sitting quietly beneath one of Europe's most beautiful regions, and right now, at this very moment, it's doing something Yellowstone hasn't done in decades. What makes this even more remarkable is that over 500,000 people wake up every single morning, eat breakfast, send their kids to school, and go about their daily routines directly above this awakening giant, most of them barely giving it a second thought. Stay with me for the next several minutes, because we're going to uncover exactly what's happening beneath the ground in southern Italy, why scientists are watching this volcano more closely than perhaps any other on Earth right now, and what it means when a supervolcano that's been relatively quiet for centuries suddenly becomes more active than the one everyone's been worrying about. This isn't some distant geological curiosity that only matters to scientists in laboratories. This is a real-time situation unfolding right now, involving real families, real communities, and a volcanic system that's been steadily waking up for years, while most of the world's attention remained focused elsewhere. The data coming from monitoring stations tells a story that's both fascinating and deeply significant. A story about what happens when ancient forces beneath our feet begin to stir after a long sleep. Let me take you to a place most people couldn't find on a map if you asked them, yet it sits among the most closely monitored pieces of ground anywhere on our planet. The region is called Campi Flegrei, which translates from Italian as burning fields, and it spreads across a landscape west of Naples, Italy. If you've ever seen pictures of the stunning Bay of Naples, with Mount Vesuvius rising dramatically in the background, you've seen part of this story. But Vesuvius, famous for burying Pompeii in ash centuries ago, isn't the volcano we're talking about today. Campi Flegrei is different. It's not a single mountain you can point to and photograph. Instead, it's what geologists call a caldera, a massive sunken volcanic bowl created when a huge eruption thousands of years ago emptied the magma chamber beneath the surface, causing the ground above to collapse inward. Picture a giant's footprint pressed into the earth, measuring roughly 8 miles across. Within this ancient crater, life has flourished for millennia. Towns and cities have been built. Families have made homes. The Romans built temples here, attracted by the area's volcanic hot springs. Today, the entire region is densely populated, with towns like Pozzuoli sitting right in the heart of the caldera. What these 500,000 residents live above is something geologists study with intense fascination and careful attention. Beneath their feet lies a massive underground system of magma chambers, fractured rock, superheated water and trapped gases. For most of recent history, this system has been relatively calm. Sure, there were small earthquakes now and then, minor tremors that barely rattled the coffee cups. The ground would shift slightly over the years, but nothing that caused serious alarm. Life continued in its comfortable rhythm, as it had for generations. But sometime in the past few decades, something changed. Scientists who monitor volcanic activity around the world started noticing patterns emerging from their instruments buried in the ground around Campi Flegrei. The seismometers, which detect ground shaking, began recording more frequent earthquakes. The GPS stations, which measure ground movement with incredible precision, showed something remarkable. The Earth's surface was rising, slowly but measurably, like a sleeping giant taking a deep breath. At first, these changes came gradually, almost imperceptibly. A few more small earthquakes one year than the previous year, the ground rising by tiny fractions. Scientists took note, adjusted their monitoring, and watched carefully, because they knew from studying volcanic systems around the world that sometimes these subtle changes are the first whispers of something larger stirring below. Then the whispers grew louder. The earthquakes didn't just continue, they accelerated. The ground didn't just rise, it rose faster. What had been a gentle trend became an unmistakable pattern, and that pattern has continued strengthening year after year. By the time we reached the middle of the past decade, Campi Flegrei wasn't just showing signs of unrest. It had become one of the most seismically active volcanic regions in Europe, recording thousands of earthquakes annually, with the ground beneath Poggioli rising measurably every single year. Here's what makes this situation so remarkable when you compare it to Yellowstone, the supervolcano that captures so much attention and concern. Yellowstone sits beneath Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, a vast underground magma system that scientists monitor constantly. It's enormous and powerful, and past major eruptions have had continent-wide impacts. But right now, today, Yellowstone is quiet. Its earthquake activity stays at normal background levels. The ground moves slightly up and down over time, but nothing outside expected ranges. The alert level remains at normal, which means scientists see no signs of unusual unrest or imminent danger. Campi Flegrei, on the other hand, is experiencing documented unrest right now. Not theoretical future danger. Not ancient history. Current, measurable, accelerating activity that shows up clearly in every monitoring system scientists have watching it. The earthquakes alone tell a compelling story. Campi Flegrei experiences intense seismic swarms that can rival Yellowstone's annual totals in short periods, despite Yellowstone's larger size. The ground deformation is measurable and ongoing. The release of volcanic gases has increased. Every indicator scientists use to assess volcanic systems shows Campi Flegrei in a state of heightened activity. This is why the title of this video isn't sensationalism or exaggeration. It's simply stating what the scientific data clearly demonstrates. When measured by current activity levels, this European supervolcano is objectively more active than Yellowstone right now, and the trends in the data show ongoing elevated activity across multiple indicators now. Before we go any further, I want you to do something for me if you're finding this information as fascinating as I do. Hit that like button so this video can reach more people who are curious about what's really happening with our planet's volcanic systems. Subscribe to the channel because we dive deep into geological events that matter. Events that don't always make the evening news, but deserve our attention and understanding. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, because I'm genuinely curious how many of you are hearing about Campi Flegrei for the first time today. I want to know if this story has reached your part of the world yet, or if it's been flying under the radar like it has for so many people. What we're going to do in the rest of this video is take a journey through time and beneath the Earth's surface. We'll go back to when scientists first started noticing that something unusual was happening in this corner of Italy. We'll look at how the earthquake activity has evolved and accelerated. We'll explore what's causing the ground to rise in ways that residents can actually see and feel in their daily lives. We'll go beneath the surface to understand what's happening in the magma chamber system that drives all this activity. We'll examine why this situation is different from Yellowstone, despite both being labelled supervolcanoes. We'll hear about what it's actually like for the families who live in the shadow of this volcanic unrest. And we'll look at where things stand right now, what scientists are watching for, and what the future might hold. This isn't a story about impending doom or disaster. It's a story about understanding one of the most fascinating and significant geological phenomena happening on our planet today. It's about recognising that volcanic systems don't always follow our expectations or our timelines. Sometimes the volcano everyone watches stays quiet, while another one, lesser known but equally powerful, begins to wake up. And when that happens, paying attention isn't about fear. It's about knowledge, awareness, and appreciating the incredible forces that have shaped our world since long before humans walked upon it, and these same forces that continue shaping it today, whether we notice them or not, reminding us that we live on a dynamic, living planet that's never truly still. To understand what makes the current situation at Campi Flegrei so significant, we need to step back in time and look at where this story really begins. Because volcanic unrest doesn't appear overnight like flipping a switch. It emerges gradually through subtle changes that only become clear when you know what to look for and have the instruments sensitive enough to detect them. The story of how scientists first noticed something changing beneath Naples is a story of patience, careful observation, and the gradual realization that a sleeping giant was beginning to stir. For centuries after its last major eruption, Campi Flegrei behaved like a retired volcano, showing little activity that would concern anyone living above it. The last significant eruption occurred back in 1538, a relatively small event that created a new volcanic cone called Monte Nuovo, which still stands today as a reminder of the region's volcanic nature. After that eruption, the caldera settled into a long period of relative calm. Oh, there were always signs of the volcanic system beneath. Hot springs bubbled up in places, steam vents released gases, and the ground would occasionally tremble with small earthquakes. But these were considered normal background activity for a volcanic region, nothing that suggested any immediate danger or unusual concern. The local population grew accustomed to living in this landscape. Generations were born, lived full lives, and passed away without ever experiencing anything more dramatic than the occasional minor tremor. The volcanic features became tourist attractions rather than sources of fear. The Solfatara crater, with its steaming vents and bubbling mud pools, drew visitors curious to see Earth's inner heat on display. Life in Pozzuoli and the surrounding towns continued with the comfortable rhythm of coastal Mediterranean communities, focused more on fishing, commerce, and daily routines than on what lay beneath the ground. But scientists who study volcanoes have learned something important over decades of research. Just because a volcano is quiet doesn't mean it's finished. Volcanic systems operate on timescales that can span centuries or millennia. A volcano might rest for hundreds of years between eruptions, its magma chamber slowly recharging, pressure gradually building, until conditions align for renewed activity. The challenge is detecting when that process begins, catching those early warning signs that distinguish normal background activity from the beginning stages of volcanic unrest. Modern volcano monitoring really began to develop in the decades following World War II, as new technologies emerged and scientific understanding deepened. Seismometers became more sensitive and more widely deployed. Scientists learned to interpret the different types of earthquakes that volcanic systems produce. GP's technology eventually allowed precise measurement of ground deformation. Gas monitoring equipment could detect changes in the composition and quantity of volcanic emissions. Gradually, volcanic regions around the world, including Campi Flegrei, became instrumented with networks of sensors that could detect changes human senses would never notice. At Campi Flegrei, this monitoring network was established and gradually expanded through the latter decades of the 20th century. The Italian National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, known by its Italian acronym INGV, took responsibility for watching this volcanic system. Scientists buried seismometers in the ground to detect earthquakes. They installed GPS stations to measure ground movement. They monitored gas emissions from fumaroles and measured ground temperature. They watched and recorded, building up a baseline understanding of what normal looked like for this particular volcanic system. And then, sometime during the period when the calendar was turning from one millennium to the next, the data started showing changes. They were subtle at first, the kind of changes that only become apparent when you compare measurements over months and years rather than days or weeks. Seismometers started recording slightly more earthquake activity, not dramatic swarms of powerful quakes, but a gradual uptick in frequency. Small earthquakes that had been occasional became more regular. The pattern was shifting. Even more interesting was what the ground itself was doing. GP's measurements showed that the surface elevation at certain points within the caldera was increasing. In simple terms, the ground was rising, being pushed upward from below by forces operating deep beneath the surface. This phenomenon, called ground deformation, is one of the most important signs scientists watch for when monitoring volcanic systems. When magma moves underground, when pressure builds in the volcanic plumbing system, When fluids migrate through fractured rock, the ground surface can respond by deforming, rising in some places, sinking in others, stretching or compressing horizontally. The ground deformation at Campi Flegrei wasn't measured in dramatic numbers at first. We're talking about changes that accumulated slowly over time, fractions of inches per year, initially. But the instruments don't lie, and when those measurements are tracked consistently over years, patterns emerge. The ground was rising. More significantly, it wasn't rising and then falling back down in a simple cycle. The trend was consistently upward, suggesting that whatever was causing this deformation wasn't a temporary fluctuation, but rather an ongoing process. Scientists published papers describing what they were seeing. They held conferences where they shared data with colleagues from volcanic regions around the world. They compared what was happening at Campi Flegrei to patterns observed at other restless calderas, and the more they looked, the more it became clear that this wasn't just normal background fluctuation. The volcanic system was responding to something happening deep below, some process that was introducing new energy, new pressure, new stress into the rocks and magma chambers beneath Naples. What makes volcanic monitoring both fascinating and challenging is that these early signs don't come with a clear prediction attached. The instruments can tell you what's happening, but they can't tell you what's going to happen next or when. Increased earthquake activity and ground deformation at a volcanic system might continue for years or decades without leading to an eruption. They might fluctuate up and down. They might eventually calm back down to background levels, or they might be the opening chapters of a story that builds toward more significant activity. Scientists monitoring Campi Flegrei couldn't predict which path the volcano would follow, but they could recognise that the volcano had entered a period of unrest that deserved close attention. The sleeping giant hadn't fully awakened, but it was definitely shifting in its sleep, and those shifts were becoming more frequent and more pronounced as the years passed. The fascinating thing about this period of initial awakening is how it challenges our expectations about volcanic timescales. We're used to thinking of volcanic eruptions as sudden, dramatic events. A volcano is quiet, then suddenly it explodes. But the reality of how large volcanic systems behave is often much more gradual and complex. The awakening of Campi Flegrei has been unfolding over years and decades, a slow-motion process that requires patience and careful attention to detect and understand. For the residents living above all this, life continued more or less as normal during these early years of awakening. Most people don't spend their days checking ground deformation measurements or earthquake counts. They go to work, raise their families, enjoy their lives. Some long-time residents might notice that small earthquakes seemed a bit more common than they remembered from their youth. But memory is imperfect, and small earthquakes in a volcanic region don't necessarily alarm people who've lived there their whole lives. The scientists, though, were taking notes. They were watching the data accumulate. They were seeing the patterns emerge. And they knew from studying volcanic systems around the world that what starts slowly can sometimes accelerate, that the early whispers of volcanic unrest can sometimes build into something more significant. They couldn't predict the future, but they could recognise that the present was different from the past, and that difference was worth watching very carefully, because beneath their feet and beneath the homes of over 500,000 people, something was changing in the deep volcanic system that had been relatively quiet for so many centuries, and that change was just beginning. If the early signs of Campi Flegrei's awakening were like whispers, what has happened in more recent years sounds more like a steadily growing conversation, one that occasionally rises to shouts. The earthquake activity that scientists first noticed as a subtle increase has transformed into something impossible to ignore, a pattern of seismic unrest that places Campi Flegrei among the most seismically active volcanic regions in all of Europe. To understand just how dramatic this acceleration has been, we need to look at what the instruments are recording, and what that activity means both for scientists studying the volcano and for the people who feel these earthquakes as part of their daily lives. Volcanic earthquakes are different from the tectonic earthquakes that happen along fault lines like the San Andreas in California. Volcanic earthquakes are usually smaller, often much shallower, and they're caused by different processes. When magma moves through underground channels, it fractures rock. When gases escape from magma and push through surrounding material, it creates pressure changes that shake the ground. When the ground itself deforms, bending and stretching in response to pressure from below, it can slip and crack, producing earthquakes. All of these processes generate seismic signals that seismometers detect and record. In a typical year during the early period of Campi Flegrei's modern unrest, the seismometer network might record hundreds of small earthquakes. Most of these would be too small for people to feel, detectable only by instruments. A few might be strong enough that residents would feel a small shake or hear a brief rumble. This level of activity, while elevated compared to decades past, wasn't particularly alarming. Volcanic regions often experience persistent low-level earthquake activity without it leading to eruptions. But then something changed. The earthquake rate didn't just stay elevated. It started climbing higher. Years that had seen hundreds of earthquakes gave way to years with thousands of earthquakes. Not all at once, but gradually, the frequency increased. More earthquakes meant more frequent shaking, more regular reminders that something active was happening beneath the surface. What makes this acceleration particularly interesting to scientists is not just the increasing number of earthquakes, but how they occur. Rather than being spread evenly throughout the year, the earthquakes tend to cluster into what volcanologists call seismic swarms. These are episodes where numerous earthquakes occur in a short period, dozens or even hundreds of events concentrated into a few hours or days. During a swarm, residents might feel the ground shake multiple times in a single afternoon. One earthquake would hit, then another a few minutes later, then another, creating an unsettling rhythm of repeated shaking. Imagine what that's like for a moment. You're sitting in your home, maybe reading or watching television, when suddenly the ground trembles beneath you. Pictures rattle on the walls. Dishes clink in the cupboards. It lasts only a few seconds, then stops. You take a breath, maybe step outside to see if neighbours felt it too. Then, before you've fully processed what just happened, it happens again, and again. Over the course of an afternoon or evening, you might feel a dozen separate earthquakes, each one a reminder that you're living above an active volcanic system. For scientists, these swarms are particularly significant because they often indicate fluid movement underground. When magma or superheated water moves through fractures in the rock, it can trigger cascading series of small earthquakes as the rock breaks and adjusts to the moving material. Swarms can be signs that the volcanic plumbing system is active, that pressure is being redistributed, that the conditions underground are changing. The intensity of individual earthquakes has varied, with most remaining relatively small on the magnitude scale. But small doesn't always mean insignificant when you're living directly above the epicenter. Even a moderate earthquake that wouldn't cause serious damage can be frightening when it's happening right beneath your feet, especially when it's one of many in a short period. Some of the stronger earthquakes in recent years have been powerful enough to cause minor damage, cracks in walls, fallen plaster, things knocked off shelves. Schools have been evacuated as a precaution during particularly active periods. Businesses have closed temporarily when buildings needed inspection after stronger shaking. Now let's put this in context with Yellowstone, since that comparison is at the heart of understanding why Campi Flegrei's current activity is so notable. Yellowstone is an enormous volcanic system, and it does experience earthquakes regularly. The monitoring network there typically records several hundred to a couple thousand small earthquakes per year. That might sound like a lot, but it's considered normal background activity for a volcanic system of Yellowstone's size. The vast majority of these earthquakes are too small to feel. Occasionally a swarm occurs where earthquake activity spikes temporarily, but these swarms are relatively infrequent and usually don't produce earthquakes strong enough to alarm residents or damage structures. Campi Flegrei, in its most active recent periods, has been recording earthquake activity that exceeds Yellowstone's annual total, sometimes substantially. During particularly active years, the seismometer network at Campi Flegrei has detected several thousand earthquakes, with periods where the shaking is frequent enough that residents feel multiple earthquakes per day or even per hour during intense swarms. This isn't speculation or exaggeration. It's documented in the scientific monitoring data that INGV publishes regularly. The comparison becomes even more striking when you consider that Campi Flegrei is a much smaller system than Yellowstone. Yellowstone's caldera measures roughly 30 by 45 miles. Campi Flegrei is only about 8 miles across. For the smaller system to be experiencing comparable or higher levels of seismic activity suggests that a lot is happening in a relatively concentrated area. The energy being released, the processes occurring underground, are significant relative to the size of the volcanic system. What do scientists make of this accelerating earthquake activity? They interpret it as evidence that the volcanic system remains in a state of unrest, that the processes that began years ago when the awakening was first detected are continuing and in some ways intensifying. Earthquakes don't happen without cause. They're the result of stress being released in the Earth's crust. At Campi Flegrei, that stress is being generated by whatever's happening in the magma chamber system and the surrounding rock, pressure building, fluids moving, the ground deforming in response to forces from below. The pattern of acceleration concerns scientists because it suggests that the volcanic system hasn't found a new equilibrium. If the increased earthquake activity had stabilised at some level and stayed there for years, scientists might conclude that the system had adjusted to new conditions and was unlikely to change further in the near term. But when earthquake activity keeps trending upward, when swarms become more frequent and more intense, it suggests that the underlying processes driving the unrest are themselves escalating or evolving. For the residents of Pozzuoli and surrounding communities, this earthquake activity has become part of the backdrop of daily life in ways both mundane and profound. Parents learn to explain to their children why the ground shakes sometimes, teaching them that it's natural, that scientists are watching, that there's no need for panic. School officials keep earthquake response procedures fresh and practiced. Local government holds meetings to discuss building safety and emergency preparedness. Some residents have grown so accustomed to the frequent small earthquakes that they barely react anymore. Just a quick glance around when things rattle, then back to whatever they were doing. Others find the constant shaking more difficult to adapt to. There's a psychological weight that comes with living somewhere that reminds you regularly, through literal ground-shaking evidence, that you're situated above active volcanic forces. Some people have chosen to leave, relocating to other areas where the ground stays still. Others stay because their homes, their families, their livelihoods are all rooted in this place, and they've made the decision that the risk is worth accepting to remain in the community they love. The earthquake acceleration at Campi Flegrei tells a story that's still being written, chapter by chapter, tremor by tremor. It's a story about a volcanic system that's unmistakably active right now, not in some theoretical future, but today, this year, this month. It's a story that places Campi Flegrei in a category that very few volcanic systems currently occupy. Volcanoes experiencing sustained, documented, and accelerating unrest over a period of years. And while earthquakes alone don't predict eruptions, they're one of several interconnected signs that scientists watch carefully. Because when multiple indicators all trend in the same direction, when earthquakes increase while the ground rises and gas emissions change, the picture that emerges is one of a volcanic system that's actively responding to changing conditions deep below the surface, conditions we're only beginning to fully understand. While earthquake activity provides the most immediately noticeable evidence of Campi Flegrei's unrest, there's another phenomenon happening that might be even more remarkable. Something that unfolds so gradually that you could watch it every day and never notice, yet when measured with precision, instruments over months and years, it reveals forces at work beneath the surface that are almost difficult to comprehend. The ground itself is rising, not in some metaphorical sense, but literally, measurably moving upward, pushed from below by pressures operating deep in the volcanic system. This ground deformation is perhaps the most compelling evidence that Campi Flegrei is not just experiencing isolated earthquake swarms, but is responding to a sustained process of pressure accumulation that continues to this day. To understand what ground deformation means, picture the Earth's surface not as something solid and unchanging, but as a flexible layer that can bend and bulge in response to forces acting on it from below. The rocky crust we walk on sits atop much deeper layers that include magma chambers, regions of partially molten rock, networks of fractures filled with superheated water and gases. When conditions in those deeper layers change, when magma volume increases, when gas pressure builds, when fluids migrate, that surface layer responds by deforming. It can rise or sink, it can stretch or compress. These movements might be tiny, but with modern GPS equipment that can measure positions to within fractions of an inch, scientists can detect and track these deformations with remarkable precision. At Campi Flegrei, the GPS monitoring network has documented upward movement of the ground surface that has accumulated over years into measurements that anyone can understand. The centre of the caldera, particularly the area around Pozzuoli, has experienced uplift measured in inches and feet over the period since modern monitoring began. The ground hasn't risen all at once, but gradually, persistently, year after year. Some periods have seen faster rates of uplift than others, but the overall trend has been consistently upward. Think about what that means in practical terms. If you measured the elevation of a specific point in Pozzuoli decades ago, and measured that exact same point today, you'd find it's noticeably higher than it used to be. The change isn't dramatic enough that someone walking the streets would perceive it. You can't see the ground rising beneath your feet as you go about your day. But the instruments don't lie, and when you accumulate those tiny increments of uplift over years, they add up to significant total change. What makes this ground rise particularly interesting is that it hasn't been uniform across the entire caldera. The maximum uplift has occurred near the centre, around the Pozzuoli area, creating what scientists describe as a dome-shaped deformation pattern. Imagine gently pushing up on the centre of a flexible sheet. The centre rises most, while areas farther away rise less, creating a gradual bulge. That's essentially what's been happening at Campi Flegrei, with the ground deforming in response to pressure applied from below at some depth. The effects of this rising ground aren't just abstract measurements on scientific instruments. They manifest in visible, tangible ways that residents can observe if they know what to look for. The harbour at Pozzuoli has experienced changes as the ground beneath it has risen, affecting water depths and requiring adjustments over the years. Buildings have developed cracks as the ground they sit on has shifted, not all at once in a dramatic earthquake, but slowly, persistently, as the foundation beneath them moves incrementally upward. Roads and infrastructure have been affected. The landscape itself has changed in subtle but real ways. Historical records show that Campi Flegrei has experienced episodes of ground deformation before in centuries past, periods when the ground rose significantly and then later subsided. These episodes occurred long before modern monitoring equipment existed, so scientists learn about them through historical accounts, archaeological evidence, and geological markers. Ancient Roman structures along the coast now sit at different elevations than they did when first built, evidence of the ground rising and falling over centuries. This tells us that ground deformation at Campi Flegrei isn't a new phenomenon, but rather part of the volcano's long-term behaviour pattern. What's driving this current episode of Uplift? The answer lies in what's happening beneath the surface, in the complex volcanic plumbing system that scientists can't directly observe but can infer from various types of monitoring data. When magma moves upward through the crust, it displaces the rock and material above it, causing the surface to rise. When gases exsolve from magma, bubbling out like carbonation escaping from a shaken soda, they increase pressure in the magma chamber, which can inflate it like a balloon, pushing the ground above upward. When superheated water accumulates in the fractured rock around a magma body, it can create pressure that deforms the surface. Scientists studying Campi Flegrei believe the ground deformation is likely caused by some combination of these processes. New magma may be entering the volcanic system from deep below, accumulating in chambers beneath the caldera. Gases may be accumulating and increasing pressure. Fluids superheated by volcanic heat may be migrating through the rock. The exact mix of processes is difficult to determine definitively, but the evidence is clear that something below is exerting upward pressure strong enough to raise the ground surface measurably over extended periods. What makes the current episode particularly significant is not just that it's happening, but that it has persisted for so long. Ground deformation at volcanic systems can sometimes be a temporary phenomenon. The ground rises for a period, then falls back down as pressure is released or fluids drain away. But at Campi Flegrei, the uplift has been sustained for years, with periods of acceleration where the rate of rise increased. This sustained nature suggests that whatever's feeding the deformation isn't a one-time injection of magma or fluids, but an ongoing process that continues to add pressure to the system. The rate of ground rise has varied over time. Some periods have seen relatively slow uplift, while others have experienced acceleration where the ground rose more quickly. Scientists monitor these changes in rate carefully, because acceleration can indicate that conditions are changing underground, that new magma might be arriving, that gas pressure might be building more rapidly. When ground deformation rate increases, alert levels may be raised and monitoring intensity increased. For scientists, ground deformation data is particularly valuable because it can be analysed using mathematical models to infer what's happening at depth. By looking at the pattern of how the ground surface has deformed, where it's risen most, where it's risen less, how the deformation has spread, scientists can create models that suggest the depth, size and pressure of whatever's causing the deformation below. These models indicate that the source of the deformation at Campi Flegrei is located at a relatively shallow depth beneath the caldera, probably a few miles down, which is geologically shallow for a volcanic system. The connection between ground deformation and earthquake activity becomes clear when you understand what's happening physically. As the ground rises and stretches, as pressure builds from below, stress accumulates in the rocks. Eventually that stress exceeds the strength of the rock, and it breaks, producing an earthquake. So the two phenomena, rising ground and increasing earthquakes, aren't separate issues, but are interconnected symptoms of the same underlying process. The pressure from below causes both the deformation and the fracturing. Living above ground that's rising presents unique challenges for communities. Buildings and infrastructure are designed with the assumption that the ground beneath them will remain stable. When that ground moves, even slowly, it introduces stresses that structures weren't designed to handle. This is why building inspections become important in areas experiencing ground deformation. Engineers need to assess whether structures remain safe or require reinforcement. In some cases, buildings have been evacuated or condemned when they've been too damaged by the combined effects of ground movement and earthquake shaking. The psychological aspect of living above rising ground is perhaps less immediately visceral than feeling earthquakes, because you can't directly perceive the ground rising beneath you as you go about your day, but knowing that it's happening, seeing the cracks in buildings, hearing scientists discuss pressure building beneath your community, creates its own kind of awareness and concern. It's a reminder that the earth beneath isn't static and unchanging but dynamic, responsive to forces operating at scales and depths beyond human perception most of the time, yet measurable with our instruments and undeniable in its effects. As we move forward in understanding Campi Flegrei's current state of unrest, the ground deformation stands as one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that this volcanic system is not simply experiencing a temporary blip of activity, but is responding to sustained processes occurring in its deep plumbing system. The ground doesn't rise by feet over years without significant forces driving that motion. forces rooted in the volcanic nature of what lies beneath this densely populated corner of Italy, forces that continue to push upward even now. So far we've looked at what scientists can observe and measure at the surface, the earthquakes that shake homes and rattle dishes, the ground that rises measurably year after year. These surface manifestations are fascinating in themselves, but they're really just symptoms, visible signs of processes occurring where no human can directly observe them, deep beneath the surface in a complex system of molten rock, superheated fluids and trapped gases. To truly understand what's happening at Campi Flegrei, we need to go on a journey downward in our minds, descending through layers of solid rock into the volcanic plumbing system that drives everything we've discussed so far. Imagine descending through the earth beneath Pozzuoli. At first you'd pass through the relatively solid rock that forms the uppermost crust, rock that's been fractured and shaped by volcanic activity over millennia. As you went deeper, you'd begin to encounter rock that's been heated by proximity to volcanic heat sources below. Groundwater that's percolated down from the surface would be present, but not normal groundwater. This water has been superheated by volcanic heat, reaching temperatures well above the boiling point, yet remaining liquid because of the immense pressure at depth. Continue deeper and you'd begin to encounter pockets where the rock isn't entirely solid anymore. This is the realm of the magma chamber, though that term can be misleading. When most people hear magma chamber, they picture a vast underground cavern filled with glowing liquid rock, like a subterranean lake of lava. The reality is often more complex. Magma chambers are regions where rock is hot enough that portions have melted, creating a mixture of solid crystals, liquid magma, and dissolved gases. It's more like a spongy mixture than a pure liquid lake, though the exact state depends on temperature, pressure, and composition. At Campi Flegrei, the volcanic system includes magma chambers at various depths, though the most relevant to current activity appears to be at relatively shallow depth, perhaps just a few miles beneath the surface. This is close enough that changes in pressure or volume in the chamber can directly affect the ground surface above through the deformation we discussed earlier. The magma in these chambers isn't necessarily moving upward rapidly toward the surface, but it's present. It's hot, and it's capable of affecting everything around it. One of the most important aspects of volcanic magma isn't just the molten rock itself, but what's dissolved in it. Magma contains gases, primarily water vapour, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and others. These gases are dissolved in the molten rock while it's under high pressure at depth, similar to how carbon dioxide is dissolved in a bottle of soda before you open it. As long as the pressure remains high, the gases stay dissolved. But if pressure decreases, or if the magma rises to shallower depths where pressure is lower, those gases begin to come out of solution, forming bubbles. This process of gas exsolution is critically important in volcanic systems. When gases bubble out of magma, they take up much more volume than they did when dissolved, causing the magma to expand. This expansion increases pressure in the magma chamber and surrounding rock. If enough gas accumulates, the pressure can become enormous, enough to fracture rock, force magma upward, or, in extreme cases, drive an explosive eruption when the pressure finally exceeds the strength of the rock confining it. At Campi Flegrei, scientists have detected clear evidence of gas release from the volcanic system. Fumaroles, vents where volcanic gases escape to the surface, dot the landscape within the caldera. The Solfatara crater is perhaps the most famous, where visitors can observe steam and gases venting from the ground, smell the sulphurous odours, and see the mineral deposits left behind as the gases cool and precipitate minerals. Monitoring equipment at these vents measures the quantity and composition of gases being released. What scientists have observed in recent years is that gas emissions have changed in ways that correlate with the increased seismic activity and ground deformation. The amount of gas being released has increased during some periods. The composition has shifted, with proportionally more deep-sourced gases like carbon dioxide appearing, suggesting that gases from deeper in the volcanic system are making their way to the surface. These changes in gas emissions are important because they provide clues about what's happening at depth in the magma chambers. One of the key questions scientists have been investigating is whether new magma is entering the volcanic system from deeper sources. Volcanic systems aren't isolated. They're fed by magma rising from the mantle, the layer beneath the Earth's crust where temperatures are hot enough to melt rock. If new batches of magma rise from depth and inject into shallower magma chambers, they bring new heat, new material, and potentially new gases. This process, sometimes called magma recharge, can be a precursor to renewed volcanic activity. Evidence suggests that Campi Flegrei may indeed be experiencing magma recharge. Studies using various geophysical techniques have attempted to image what's happening beneath the caldera. These studies use earthquake waves, ground deformation patterns, gravity measurements, and other data to create models of the subsurface structure. The results suggest that magma is present at shallow depths, and that the system may be receiving fresh magma from below. The presence of rising magma doesn't automatically mean an eruption is imminent. Magma can rise to shallow levels and then stall, cooling and solidifying without ever reaching the surface. Volcanic systems can experience episodes of magma intrusion that produce unrest, earthquakes, deformation, gas release, but don't culminate in eruptions. This happened at numerous volcanic systems around the world. The challenge for scientists is determining which episodes of unrest will lead to eruptions, and which will eventually subside without eruptive activity. Another factor in the underground story is the role of hydrothermal fluids. These are water-based fluids that have been heated to extreme temperatures by contact with hot rock or magma. At Campi Flegrei, the volcanic system has an active hydrothermal component, with hot fluids circulating through fractured rock. These fluids can carry dissolved minerals and gases. They can transport heat from deeper to shallower levels. And importantly, they can affect pressure in the system. If fluids accumulate in pockets, or if their pressure changes, it can cause ground deformation and earthquakes, just as magma movement can. Some scientists believe that much of Campi Flegrei's current unrest might be driven primarily by hydrothermal fluids rather than by magma directly approaching the surface. According to this interpretation, magma at depth is heating fluids, and those fluids are migrating upward, accumulating pressure and causing the observed deformation and seismicity. Other scientists think magma itself is playing a more direct role, rising to shallower depths. The truth may involve both processes working together, making the underground situation complex and not easily reduced to a simple explanation. What's clear from multiple lines of evidence is that the volcanic system beneath Campi Flegrei is not dormant. It's thermally active, with significant heat flowing from depth toward the surface. It contains magma at relatively shallow levels by geological standards. It's releasing gases that originate deep in the system. It's accumulating pressure sufficient to raise the ground surface and fracture rock in ways that generate thousands of earthquakes. All of these factors together paint a picture of a volcanic system that's very much alive and active, even if it's not currently erupting. The timeframes involved in volcanic processes can be difficult for humans to grasp. We think in terms of days, months, maybe years. Volcanic systems operate on those timeframes sometimes, but also on much longer ones. Magma can take years or decades to rise from deep sources to shallow chambers. Pressure can accumulate gradually over long periods. A volcanic system can show signs of unrest for years without erupting, or conversely, can accelerate rapidly from relative quiet to eruption in a matter of weeks. Scientists studying Campi Flegrei face the challenge of interpreting what the current unrest means for the future. The underground processes we've discussed, magma potentially rising, gases accumulating, fluids migrating, are all consistent with a volcanic system that could move toward more significant activity. But they're also consistent with a system that might continue in its current state of elevated but stable unrest for years or even decades. Without a clear precedent for exactly this situation, scientists must rely on continued monitoring, on comparing with other volcanic systems worldwide, and on building ever more sophisticated models of what's happening beneath the surface. For the residents above, the underground story can seem almost abstract. They experience the earthquakes and hear about ground deformation. But the magma chambers, the gas accumulation, the hydrothermal fluids, these are invisible to daily experience. Yet they're the engine driving everything that people do experience. Understanding that connection, knowing that the shaking ground and rising surface aren't random, but are symptoms of powerful processes operating at depth, adds a layer of meaning to what it means to live in the shadow of an active volcanic system. A system whose full story is still being written, in magma and gas and pressure far beneath the homes and schools and streets of communities that have existed here for centuries. We've referenced Yellowstone several times already, using it as a comparison point to help understand Campi Flegrei's current activity. Now it's time to look more deeply at that comparison, to understand both what these two volcanic systems have in common, and, perhaps more importantly, how they differ. Because while both are classified as calderas, both are considered supervolcanoes based on their past eruptive history, and both are monitored carefully by scientists. The similarities largely end there. The differences between these two systems help explain why one captures global attention while remaining quiet, and the other operates in relative obscurity, despite showing clear signs of unrest. Start with size, because it's the most obvious difference. Yellowstone is massive by any measure. The caldera formed by its most recent major eruption covers roughly 30 by 45 miles. The entire volcanic system, including the magma chamber beneath, is enormous, one of the largest volcanic features on Earth. When scientists call Yellowstone a supervolcano, they're referring both to its size and to its potential. If it were to erupt at full strength, the consequences would be catastrophic on a continental or even global scale. Campi Flegrei is also classified as a supervolcano based on its past eruptive history, but it's much smaller. The caldera measures about 8 miles across, large enough to contain multiple towns and communities, but tiny compared to Yellowstone. The volcanic system is correspondingly smaller. This size difference matters because larger volcanic systems generally have longer repose times between eruptions, and their unrest can be harder to interpret given the sheer scale involved. The eruptive histories of these two systems show different patterns. Yellowstone has experienced 3 truly massive eruptions over the past couple million years, each one ejecting enormous volumes of material and reshaping the landscape. Between these major eruptions, the system has experienced smaller eruptive episodes, but the massive eruptions are what define its character and potential. The most recent major eruption occurred roughly 600,000 years ago, a timescale so long that it's difficult for human minds to fully grasp. Campi Flegrei's most powerful known eruption happened around 40,000 years ago, an event that ejected huge volumes of volcanic material across the Mediterranean region. It wasn't as large as Yellowstone's biggest eruptions, but it was still massive by any normal measure. Since then, Campi Flegrei has experienced numerous smaller eruptions over millennia, with the most recent occurring in the late 1500s, as mentioned earlier. So while both systems are capable of massive eruptions, Campi Flegrei has shown more frequent, smaller-scale activity in recent geological time. The current monitoring status of the two volcanoes differs significantly. Yellowstone is monitored extensively by the United States Geological Survey and the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, with networks of seismometers, GPS stations, gas monitors, and other instruments tracking every aspect of the volcanic system's behaviour. The monitoring consistently shows normal background activity. Yellowstone experiences earthquakes regularly, as mentioned before, but at rates and magnitudes consistent with a large volcanic system in a state of rest. The ground deformation that occurs at Yellowstone is gradual and cyclical, rising and falling over years in ways that scientists understand and consider normal. Gas emissions remain steady and typical, Every indicator scientists use to assess volcanic hazard at Yellowstone currently shows normal background levels. The official alert level at Yellowstone remains at normal, which is the lowest level on the scale the US Geological Survey uses. Normal means no significant changes are occurring, no signs of unusual unrest, no indication of increased hazard. The scientists watching Yellowstone are confident that if conditions were to change, if the volcano were to move toward a state of unrest, the monitoring network would detect it early, providing ample warning. Campi Flegrei presents a very different picture. As we've discussed extensively, the monitoring data shows clear, documented unrest. The earthquake rate is elevated. The ground is rising measurably. Gas emissions have shown changes. The alert level in Italy's volcano monitoring system has been raised to yellow, which indicates elevated activity above normal background levels. Yellow doesn't mean an eruption is imminent or even likely in the near term, but it does signify that the volcano requires heightened attention and that the situation could potentially evolve. So when we say Campi Flegrei is more active than Yellowstone right now, we're making a straightforward comparison of current monitored conditions. One system shows normal background activity. The other shows elevated activity across multiple parameters. This isn't a judgment about which volcano is more dangerous in an absolute sense, because danger depends on many factors beyond current activity level. It's simply a factual statement about present conditions. The reasons why Yellowstone captures so much public attention despite its current quiet state probably have more to do with culture and media than with geology. Yellowstone is an iconic American national park, visited by millions. It's been featured in numerous documentaries, disaster movies, and news stories. The idea of the Yellowstone supervolcano has entered popular consciousness in ways that Campi Flegrei, despite being located in a densely populated area of Europe, simply hasn't for most of the world. People know about Yellowstone. They've heard the dramatic predictions about what a major eruption would mean. That awareness creates a tension that feeds on itself. Campi Flegrei, by contrast, remains relatively unknown outside of Italy and the volcanology community. Most people couldn't tell you where it is, or that it exists at all. There's no famous national park, no iconic geyser like Old Faithful to attract millions of visitors. It's just a volcanic landscape where regular people live regular lives. And even though scientists who study volcanoes watch it closely, it hasn't captured broader public imagination the way Yellowstone has. This difference in public awareness creates an interesting irony. The volcano everyone worries about is currently quiet. The volcano fewer people know about is actively showing unrest. This doesn't mean we should panic about Campi Flegrei or stop monitoring Yellowstone. Scientists will continue watching both carefully. But it does suggest that public awareness and actual geological activity don't always align neatly. Another important difference between these systems involves timeframes and eruptive cycles. Large calderas like these don't erupt on predictable schedules, but they do tend to have very long repose periods between their major eruptions, often tens or hundreds of thousands of years. Yellowstone's last major caldera-forming eruption was 600,000 years ago. By some measures, we might be roughly due for another, but volcanic systems don't operate on strict schedules, and the range of uncertainty is enormous. The next major eruption could be thousands or hundreds of thousands of years in the future. Campi Flegrei's situation is different, because its last major eruption was more recent geologically speaking, and it has shown more frequent smaller eruptions in historical time. Its current unrest has lasted for decades now, a long period by human standards, but potentially just one phase in a much longer volcanic cycle. The system could be building towards some kind of eruptive activity, or it could be experiencing a period of unrest that will eventually subside without eruption, similar to episodes that have occurred in the past. What both systems share is uncertainty. Despite all our monitoring technology, despite decades of study, scientists cannot predict with certainty what either volcano will do next or when. They can detect changes when they occur. They can interpret what those changes might mean. They can identify trends and patterns, but they cannot look into the future and say this volcano will erupt on this date, or this volcano will definitely not erupt for the next 100 years. Volcanic systems are too complex, too influenced by factors we can't directly observe, too capable of surprising us. So the comparison between Campi Flegrei and Yellowstone ultimately teaches us something important about how we think about volcanic hazards. Size matters, but so does current activity. Past behaviour matters, but doesn't perfectly predict future behaviour. Public awareness matters for preparedness and response, but doesn't change the underlying geology. Both of these remarkable volcanic systems deserve careful monitoring and study. Both present potential hazards that need to be understood and planned for. But right now, in this moment, one is quiet while the other is restless. And that's a distinction worth understanding and appreciating. All the science we've discussed, all the earthquake counts and ground deformation measurements and magma chamber models, can sometimes feel abstract when presented as data and graphs. But behind every measurement is a human reality, families and communities whose daily lives unfold in the shadow of geological forces most people never have to think about. To truly understand what's happening at Campi Flegrei, we need to shift our focus from the volcanic system itself to the people who live above it, who feel its earthquakes, who see the cracks appearing in their buildings, who must make decisions about their futures with incomplete information and no guarantees. This is where the scientific story becomes a deeply human one. Pozzuoli is the heart of this human story. It's an ancient city with roots stretching back to Roman times, built on the western edge of the Campi Flegrei caldera. Today it's home to tens of thousands of residents, a working-class community with narrow streets, family-owned shops, apartment buildings that house multiple generations, schools filled with children who were born here and may well raise their own families here someday. This is not some remote outpost or scientific research station. It's a real place where real people have built real lives over decades and centuries. Walk through Pozzuoli on an ordinary day, and you'd see what you'd expect from any Italian coastal town. People shopping at the market, carrying bags of fresh vegetables and fish. Older residents sitting at cafes, talking and watching the world go by. Kids walking home from school in clusters, laughing and pushing each other playfully. Restaurants preparing for the evening service. Life continuing in all its mundane, beautiful normalcy. But talk to those residents, ask them about the earthquakes, and you'd discover an additional layer to daily life here, a constant background awareness that sets this community apart. Many long-time residents have developed a kind of calibrated response to earthquakes. When a small tremor hits, they might pause briefly, maybe glance around, but then continue with whatever they were doing. These small events have become so frequent that treating each one as a crisis would make normal life impossible. You can't stop everything you're doing multiple times a day just because the ground shook for a few seconds. So people adapt, they calibrate, they develop an internal scale of what's worth worrying about and what's just part of living here. But that adaptation comes with a psychological cost that's not always visible on the surface. There's a difference between intellectually accepting that small earthquakes are normal and feeling viscerally comfortable when your home shakes while you're trying to sleep, or when the floor moves beneath your feet while you're cooking dinner. Some residents describe a kind of constant, low-level alertness, never quite able to fully relax, because in the back of their mind they're aware that the ground could shake at any moment. Parents describe how hard it is to teach their children not to be afraid when they themselves are sometimes afraid. The schools in the area have become experts in earthquake response. Evacuation drills are regular occurrences, more frequent than in most places. Teachers are trained to respond quickly when shaking starts during class, moving children to doorways or outside depending on the intensity. On several occasions during particularly strong earthquakes or intense swarms, schools have been evacuated as a precaution. Classes cancelled, children sent home early. Each time this happens, parents face that spike of fear. That moment of wondering if this is the time something more serious is happening. Building damage is another constant reality. Old structures in particular have suffered from the combined effects of repeated earthquakes and ground deformation. Cracks appear in walls, plaster falls. Sometimes structural elements are damaged enough that buildings become unsafe. Local authorities conduct regular inspections, identifying buildings that need reinforcement or even evacuation. Some structures have been reed-tagged, declared off-limits because they're no longer safe to occupy. For families displaced this way, the volcano's unrest isn't an abstract scientific phenomenon. It's the reason they had to leave their home, find a new place to live, uproot their lives. The economic impact ripples through the community in ways large and small. Property values in areas most affected by earthquakes and deformation have declined, because who wants to buy a home where the ground shakes regularly and might develop cracks from ground movement? Business owners worry about how the situation affects tourism and economic activity. Some businesses have closed, unable or unwilling to continue operating in these conditions. Others persist, either because they can't afford to relocate or because they're committed to staying in the community, despite the challenges. Government officials at local and regional levels face extraordinarily difficult decisions. They're responsible for public safety, But they also recognise the enormous disruption that evacuation or mandatory relocation would cause. When do you decide that the risk is severe enough to force people to leave their homes? Campi Flegrei's unrest has continued for years now without an eruption. If authorities had ordered evacuation every time earthquake activity increased, they would have disrupted hundreds of thousands of lives repeatedly, only for the heightened activity to subside again without eruption. But if they wait too long and something more serious develops, they could be responsible for not acting soon enough. This is the impossible position authorities find themselves in with long-term volcanic unrest. There's no clear line that says before this point, evacuation is unnecessary. After this point, it's essential. It's all judgment calls based on probability assessments, risk calculations, and incomplete information about what the volcano might do next. So officials have developed graduated response plans. There are evacuation zones defined based on modelling of different eruption scenarios. There are warning systems in place. There are regular meetings between civil protection authorities and scientists to assess the current situation. The plan is to move deliberately as conditions change, to escalate response in proportion to the assessed hazard, trying to balance safety against the enormous social and economic costs of larger-scale evacuation. For residents, this creates a peculiar form of uncertainty to live with. They know evacuation plans exist. They know their homes might fall within evacuation zones if the situation worsens. But they don't know if or when that evacuation might actually be ordered. So they live with one foot in normal life and one foot mentally prepared for the possibility that someday, maybe soon or maybe years from now, they might receive an evacuation order and have to leave, possibly permanently. Some residents have made the personal decision to leave already, not waiting for official evacuation orders. They've sold their properties if they could, packed up their lives, and relocated to areas with quieter ground. For them, the constant earthquakes and the unknowable future risk weren't worth staying. Others have chosen to remain, for various reasons. Some because they can't afford to move, because their economic situation ties them to this place. Others because their entire family and social network is here, and they're unwilling to abandon that for an uncertain danger. Still others because they simply love this place, because it's home in the deepest sense, and they've decided that whatever comes, they'd rather face it here than live somewhere else. There's also a generational aspect to how people respond. Older residents who've lived in Pozzuoli their entire lives often take a more fatalistic view. They've felt earthquakes before, they've lived through previous periods of increased activity, and they're less inclined to uproot themselves now. Younger parents with small children sometimes feel differently, more aware of the risks they're exposing their kids to, more willing to consider relocating for their children's safety, even if it means leaving behind everything they've known. Community bonds have actually strengthened in some ways because of the shared experience. When everyone around you is dealing with the same earthquakes, the same uncertainty, the same difficult decisions, it creates a form of solidarity. Neighbours check on each other after stronger earthquakes. People share information and rumours about what scientists are saying. There's a collective resilience that develops when a whole community faces a challenge together. But there's also tension and disagreement. Some residents are angry at authorities for not doing more, for not providing clearer information or more support. Others are angry at scientists, feeling that the monitoring and research somehow contributes to property value decline without providing clear answers about when or if real danger will materialise. Still, others are simply tired, exhausted by years of living with this situation, wanting it to somehow resolve one way or another, rather than continue indefinitely. What emerges from all these individual stories and responses is a portrait of human resilience and human vulnerability existing side by side. People adapt to remarkable circumstances. They find ways to continue living, working, raising families, finding joy even when the ground beneath them literally shakes. But that adaptation doesn't mean the situation is easy, or that the psychological and emotional costs aren't real. Living above an active volcanic system in a state of ongoing unrest is, in the end, living with uncertainty at a level most people never experience. Carrying that weight day after day, year after year, making peace with the fact that tomorrow might bring an earthquake that's stronger than the ones before, or might bring news that the scientific assessment has changed and evacuation is now necessary, or might bring nothing different at all, just another day in the shadow of forces so much larger than any individual or community, but which nevertheless shape every aspect of daily life here. Bringing our journey to the present moment, Where do things stand right now with Campi Flegrei? What are scientists seeing in the monitoring data as we move through this year? What are they specifically watching for? And what do those observations tell us about where this situation might be heading? These are the questions that matter most to anyone trying to understand not just the history or the science, but the current reality and near-term future of this volcanic system's unrest. As of now, early in this year, Campi Flegrei remains in a state of elevated unrest. The earthquake activity that accelerated over recent years continues. The monitoring networks record seismic events regularly, with periodic swarms where earthquake frequency spikes higher for hours or days. The ground deformation that has characterised this episode of unrest is ongoing, with GPS measurements showing continued uplift in the central caldera area. Gas emissions from fumaroles continue at elevated levels. By every measurable parameter, the volcanic system remains more active than its long-term baseline, continuing the pattern of unrest that has now persisted for years. This doesn't mean conditions are static. Volcanic unrest has rhythms and fluctuations. Some periods see more intense earthquake activity, while other periods are relatively quieter. The rate of ground deformation varies, accelerating at times and slowing at others. These fluctuations are normal for volcanic systems in unrest, and scientists track them carefully because changes in patterns can sometimes indicate that conditions underground are evolving. The monitoring infrastructure watching Campi Flegrei is extensive and sophisticated. INGV operates a dense network of seismometers throughout the caldera and surrounding region, positioned to detect even small earthquakes and to precisely locate their depth and position. GPS stations continuously measure ground position at numerous points, providing real-time data on any deformation. Tilt meters detect tiny changes in ground angle that might indicate magma movement or pressure changes. Gas monitoring stations at fumaroles analyse the composition and quantity of volcanic gases being released. Temperature sensors track thermal changes. Satellite-based radar instruments measure ground deformation across wide areas. All of this data feeds into analysis centres where scientists can examine patterns, compare with historical data, and assess what the volcano is doing at any given moment. What specifically are scientists watching for in all this data? They're looking for changes that might indicate the volcanic system is moving toward a more dangerous state. A sustained increase in earthquake frequency or intensity could suggest magma moving upward or pressure building to critical levels. Acceleration in ground deformation rate could indicate that new magma is entering the system, or that pressure is increasing more rapidly. Changes in gas composition, particularly increases in gases that come from deeper magma sources, could signal that fresh magma is approaching shallower levels. Any of these changes, especially if multiple parameters change together in coordinated ways, would prompt scientists to raise alert levels and recommend enhanced precautions. But scientists are also watching for signs that the current unrest might be stabilising or even decreasing. If earthquake rates were to decline sustainably, if ground deformation were to slow or reverse, if gas emissions were to decrease, these could be signs that whatever process has been driving the unrest is waning, that pressure is being released rather than continuing to build. Volcanic unrest can subside without eruption, and that remains a possible outcome for Campi Flegrei. The question everyone wants answered, of course, is whether Campi Flegrei will erupt. Will the current unrest lead to volcanic activity, or will it eventually calm down as it has in past episodes? Scientists cannot answer this question with certainty, and anyone who claims they can is either misinformed or being dishonest. Volcanic systems are too complex, influenced by too many factors that cannot be directly observed or precisely measured, to allow definitive prediction of whether or when eruption will occur. What scientists can say, based on the monitoring data and their understanding of how volcanic systems behave, is that Campi Flegrei is showing signs of unrest consistent with a system where magma and volcanic fluids are active at shallow depths beneath the caldera. The system is releasing accumulated stress through earthquakes and gas emissions, and it's deforming in response to pressure from below. These are all processes that can occur without leading to eruption, but they're also processes that could potentially precede an eruption if conditions continue to evolve in certain directions. The alert level for Campi Flegrei is currently at yellow in the Italian system, indicating that the volcano is above normal background activity, but not at imminent risk of eruption. Yellow is the middle of the alert scale. Green would mean normal conditions. Orange would indicate escalating unrest with possible eruption within weeks or months. Red would mean eruption is imminent or in progress. So yellow represents a state of heightened attention without immediate crisis, a recognition that the volcano requires careful watching but doesn't currently present an emergency situation. This alert level could change if monitoring data shows significant changes in the volcano's behaviour. If unrest escalates substantially, the alert could be raised to orange, which would trigger more intensive monitoring and potentially precautionary evacuations of the highest risk areas. Conversely, if unrest decreases sustainably, the alert could eventually be lowered back to green. The alert system is designed to be dynamic, responding to what the volcano is actually doing, rather than being set based on theoretical concerns. Scientists study Campi Flegrei for reasons beyond just monitoring the immediate hazard to local communities, important as that is. This volcanic system serves as a natural laboratory for understanding how calderas behave during periods of unrest. Every earthquake, every measurement of ground deformation, every gas sample adds to the scientific understanding of volcanic processes. Data from Campi Flegrei is published in scientific journals analysed by researchers around the world and compared with data from other volcanic systems to identify patterns and improve our general understanding of how volcanoes work. Research continues into the specific processes driving Campi Flegrei's current unrest. Scientists use various techniques to try to image what's happening beneath the surface. Seismic tomography, which uses earthquake waves to create three-dimensional pictures of underground structure, helps identify where magma might be located and how the volcanic plumbing system is configured. Geochemical analysis of gases and spring waters provides clues about the depth and composition of material feeding the system. Modelling studies try to match observed ground deformation with theoretical sources at depth. All of this research aims to build a more complete picture of what's actually happening beneath Campi Flegrei and what it might mean for future behaviour. The reality of modern volcano monitoring is that it's a process of continuous assessment rather than simple binary prediction. Scientists don't just monitor and then one day announce it will erupt or it won't erupt. Instead, they continuously evaluate probability based on current conditions. As long as unrest continues, there remains some probability of eventual eruption, but that probability varies depending on what the monitoring data shows. The job of scientists is to track those changing probabilities and to communicate clearly with civil protection authorities about what the data suggests regarding potential hazards. For Campi Flegrei specifically, the current scientific assessment is that while unrest continues and while the unrest indicates active processes at depth, there are no immediate signs that eruption is about to occur in the short term. This could change if monitoring data shows significant escalation in activity. It's also true that volcanic systems can sometimes escalate rapidly, transitioning from a state of chronic unrest to pre-eruptive crisis over relatively short timescales. This is why continuous monitoring is so important, and why alert systems are designed to respond quickly to changing conditions. The broader context is that Campi Flegrei is one of many volcanic systems around the world that scientists monitor because they pose potential hazards to populated areas. Some volcanoes are in states of eruption or high unrest right now, others are quiet. Campi Flegrei occupies a middle ground, neither fully quiet nor in immediate crisis, but clearly active and requiring sustained attention. How its current episode of unrest will ultimately resolve, whether it will escalate toward eruption, whether it will slowly decline back toward background levels, or whether it will continue at current levels for years more, remains to be seen. What's certain is that scientists will continue watching, instruments will continue recording, and analysis will continue trying to interpret what this remarkable volcanic system is doing. Every earthquake adds a data point. Every GPS measurement refines understanding of ground deformation patterns. Every gas sample provides a glimpse of what's happening at depth. Slowly, patiently, the scientific picture becomes clearer even as uncertainty about the future remains. This is the nature of studying active volcanic systems. Rich in data, fascinating in complexity, but always retaining elements of unpredictability that remind us that nature operates on its own schedule, not ours, and that our role is to observe, understand as best we can, and prepare for various possibilities rather than claiming certainty we don't possess. Before we close this exploration of Campi Flegrei and its current state of unrest, it's worth stepping back to consider a larger question. Why should someone who lives nowhere near Italy, who may never visit Naples or even Europe, care about what's happening at this particular volcano? What's the broader significance of Campi Flegrei's story beyond the immediate concerns of the communities living in the caldera? These questions take us from the specific to the universal, from one volcanic system to the nature of how humans have learned to live on a dynamic, geologically active planet? Start with the most direct answer. What scientists learn from monitoring and studying Campi Flegrei has applications far beyond this single volcano. Volcanic systems share fundamental characteristics, even though each one has unique aspects. The processes that cause unrest at Campi Flegrei, the ways that magma and gases and fluids interact beneath a caldera, the patterns of earthquakes and deformation that accompany volcanic unrest, these are patterns that appear at volcanic systems worldwide. When scientists develop better understanding of how Campi Flegrei behaves, when they refine their interpretation of monitoring data or improve their models of what's happening underground, those advances benefit volcano monitoring everywhere. There are hundreds of active or potentially active volcanoes around the world, many of them in populated regions where eruptions would pose serious hazards. Japan has numerous active volcanoes near major cities. Indonesia's volcanoes threaten millions of people living on densely populated islands. The Cascade Range in the Pacific Northwest of the United States includes volcanoes near cities like Seattle and Portland. Central America, South America, the Philippines, Italy, Greece, Iceland, Hawaii, Alaska, New Zealand, the list goes on. Millions of people globally live within potential hazard zones of volcanoes. For all those communities, the quality of volcano monitoring and the scientific understanding of how volcanic systems behave directly affects their safety. Better monitoring means earlier warning when a volcano moves toward eruption. Better understanding means more accurate assessment of hazards and risks. Better communication between scientists and civil authorities means better decision-making about evacuations and emergency response. The entire global network of volcano observatories and monitoring centres benefits when knowledge advances anywhere in the system. Campi Flegrei, because it's been in a prolonged state of measurable unrest with intensive monitoring for years now, serves as an important case study. Many volcanoes are either quiet or they erupt without long periods of detectable precursory unrest. Calderas, like Campi Flegrei, that show extended unrest periods provide opportunities to study volcanic processes in detail over time, to track how conditions evolve, to test whether modelling and monitoring techniques can successfully interpret what's happening, and provide useful hazard assessment. The data and knowledge gained here contribute to the collective scientific understanding that ultimately helps protect people living near volcanoes anywhere. There's also a climate connection worth understanding. Large volcanic eruptions can affect global climate by injecting ash and gases high into the atmosphere where they spread worldwide and reflect sunlight, causing temporary cooling. The eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in the early 1990s caused measurable global temperature decreases for a couple of years afterward. While Campi Flegrei isn't currently erupting, and if it did erupt, the size of the eruption would determine climate impact, it's worth recognising that volcanic activity and climate are connected systems. Understanding volcanic activity is part of understanding the complex Earth system that determines climate patterns. Economic connections exist as well. Volcanic eruptions can disrupt air travel over wide regions, affecting commerce and travel far from the volcano itself. The eruption of Eyjafjallajökull in Iceland in the year 2010 created ash clouds that shut down air travel across Europe for days, stranding millions of travellers and costing economies billions. Volcanic hazards are not purely local phenomena in our interconnected world. Understanding and monitoring volcanic systems, even ones in other countries or continents, has practical value for economic stability and continuity. But perhaps the deepest reason why Campi Flegrei matters more broadly is what it teaches about humanity's relationship with the planet we inhabit. We live on a geologically active world, a planet where the interior remains hot and dynamic, where tectonic plates shift and grind and collide, where magma rises and volcanoes erupt, where the ground beneath our feet is subject to forces operating on scales of time and power that dwarf human civilization. This is simply the nature of Earth. For most of human history, these forces were mysterious and terrifying, attributed to gods or supernatural powers because there was no scientific framework to understand them. Volcanic eruptions were divine punishment or the anger of the gods. Earthquakes were omens or curses. People lived with these phenomena, but couldn't truly understand them, couldn't predict them, could only react when they occurred and hope for survival and recovery afterward. The development of modern Earth science, and volcano monitoring specifically, represents one of humanity's great achievements. We've gone from helpless ignorance to genuine understanding. We can't control volcanic systems or prevent eruptions, but we can observe them, measure them, interpret what's happening, assess hazards, and provide warnings that save lives. The monitoring networks at places like Campi Flegrei are triumphs of human ingenuity and cooperation. examples of science serving society by turning natural phenomena from mysteries into understood processes. That understanding breeds not fear, but appropriate respect. When you understand how volcanic systems work, when you see the data and recognise the patterns, you can appreciate both the power of these natural processes and the fact that with proper monitoring and preparation, communities can live safely even in volcanic regions. Fear comes from ignorance. Knowledge provides a foundation for reasonable precaution without panic. Campi Flegrei also reminds us that geological processes don't respect political borders or human timescales. The volcanic system beneath Naples doesn't care that over 500,000 people live above it, doesn't operate according to convenient schedules, doesn't pause for elections or economic crises or anything else in the human world. It follows the physics of heat and pressure and fluid dynamics, operating on its own natural rhythms. Humans must adapt to that reality, rather than expecting it to adapt to us. This perspective becomes increasingly important as human population grows and spreads into more areas that are subject to natural hazards. More people live near volcanoes, in earthquake zones, in areas threatened by floods or hurricanes or other natural phenomena than ever before in human history. We can't simply avoid all hazardous areas. There are too many people and too many different hazards for that to be practical. Instead, we must learn to live with these hazards intelligently, using science and technology to understand them, engineering to make infrastructure more resilient, planning and preparation to protect lives even when natural disasters occur. The story of Campi Flegrei, the scientific monitoring and the community response, and the ongoing unrest without catastrophe, demonstrates that this approach can work. For years now, this volcanic system has been in unrest with thousands of earthquakes and measurable ground deformation. Yet life continues in the caldera, families remain in their homes, and no disaster has occurred. This isn't luck. It's the result of careful monitoring, clear communication between scientists and authorities, prepared response plans, and communities that understand their situation and have made informed choices about how to respond to it. Looking forward, the question isn't really whether Campi Flegrei specifically will erupt someday, over long enough timescales. All active volcanic systems experience eruptions eventually. The question is whether humanity will continue developing our capacity to live safely with these natural phenomena, whether we'll maintain and improve monitoring networks, whether we'll make wise decisions about land use and development in hazardous areas, whether we'll learn the lessons that each volcanic crisis or episode of unrest teaches us. Campi Flegrei is one chapter in that larger story, a current example of volcanic unrest that scientists watch carefully, that communities navigate day by day, and that ultimately connects to the broader human challenge of living on a dynamic planet. Understanding what's happening there, paying attention to the science and the monitoring and the human stories, isn't just about this one volcano in Italy. It's about recognizing our place in a larger natural system, about appreciating both our capabilities and our limitations, about building a relationship with Earth that acknowledges its power while using our knowledge to protect ourselves and the communities we build. So as you think about Campi Flegrei and its current state of heightened activity, more active than Yellowstone, more active than most volcanic systems anywhere right now, remember that this story matters not because we should fear it, but because we should understand it. It matters because knowledge beats ignorance. It matters because what we learn helps protect people. It matters because it reminds us that we inhabit a remarkable, powerful, dynamic world, and our job is to study it, respect it, and learn to thrive despite and alongside the forces that have shaped this planet since long before we existed, and will continue shaping it long after we're gone. If you found this deep exploration valuable, if you learned something about volcanic systems and how scientists monitor them, and what it means when a supervolcano shows signs of unrest, then please subscribe to this channel for more content that dives into the geological processes shaping our world. Share this video with others who might find it interesting, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Have you heard about Campi Flegrei before? Or was this your introduction to this fascinating volcanic system? I read the comments, and I'm genuinely curious about how awareness of these geological events spreads, and what people find most interesting or concerning. Thank you for spending this time learning about one of the most closely watched volcanoes on Earth, and stay curious about the remarkable planet we call home.